The imperialist states that were called the Great Powers in the late 19th century made plans to partition Turkey during the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and the Armenian issue was one of the most important tools of those plans. The so-called Armenian genocide claim was manufactured by the power centres that wanted to achieve their imperial goals, and it continues to exist even to this day, even though it was not based on any historical or scientific truth. Starting from the second half of the 1960s, activities like erecting memorials for the so-called genocide and declaring April 24th as the so-called Genocide Remembrance Day within parliaments began in countries such as the USA and France. These claims aim to weaken Turkey today, just as they did before. When current affairs are closely analysed, it becomes obvious that such activities have turned into a means of blackmail against Turkey. In January 1996, the Kardak Islets took Turkey and Greece to the brink of war. Shortly after, in April 1996, the Greek parliament declared 24th of April as the so-called Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day by law. In November 1998, the relations between Turkey and Italy became tense as Italy provided shelter to the terrorist leader Öcalan. The Italian parliament recognised the relocation and resettlement of Armenians as so-called genocide, based on the decision of the European Parliament in November 2000. After Nicolas Sarkozy became the Minister of the Interior of France in 2005, France pursued a policy against Turkey's potential EU membership, and the relations between the two countries became tense. In 2006, France recognised the so-called Armenian genocide and passed a bill that made its denial a crime. In 2015, the negative attitude of Sebastian Kurz, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Austria, towards Turkey adversely affected the relations between the two countries. In April 2015, the Austrian Parliament recognised the relocation and resettlement of Armenians as so-called genocide. In 2016, relations between Turkey and Germany became tense as Germany supported the terrorists of FETÖ and PKK. In July 2016, the German Federal Parliament passed the so-called Armenian Genocide Bill. Relations between Turkey and Israel became tense between 2009-2010 because of Israel's merciless use of violence against Palestinians and the events of Mavi Marmara and 1 Minute. After these events, and between 2011 and 2018, the Israeli parliament repeatedly discussed the recognition of 1915 relocation and resettlement as so-called genocide. In 2017, the Netherlands openly took a position against the Turkish referendum of 2017 and took an attitude against diplomatic practices when Turkish ministers visited the country in this period. In February 2018, the Dutch Parliament passed the bill that recognised the 1915 relocation and resettlement as so-called genocide. Turks and Armenians have always lived in harmony until the great powers started their provocations in the late 19th century with the goal of partitioning the Ottoman Empire. The Armenians served in the government as senior officials and were active in both trade and crafts. The tragedies that happened to both sides were not genocide, but events that happened in the border towns during the war. In fact, the sole source of the great psychological operation the Armenian diaspora and its supporters carried out against Turkey was a propaganda book known as the Blue Book. The Blue Book was written under the instruction of Wellington House, the propaganda bureau which operated between 1914 and 1918, within the knowledge of the British Foreign Office and the Chief of Imperial General Staff. Entirely based on the accounts of missionaries and Armenian sources, this book was written by Arnold Toynbee, one of the first advocates of the Clash of Civilizations thesis. Professor Hikmet Özdemir revealed the organisational structure of the propaganda bureau known as the Wellington House with the research he made at Kew Gardens. A department was created for all the major states in the world, and an academician was assigned to each one. Arnold Toynbee was responsible for the Ottoman Empire. In August 1914, well-known historians, social scientists and newspaper editors of Britain came together and declared their goal. A great propaganda campaign would be carried out to ensure that the US joins the war alongside Britain. They would write books, publish brochures, prepare graphs, essays, news and articles to be used by the whole press. In an interview with Robert Zeidner in Beirut in 1957, Toynbee admits in shame that all of what he wrote for the Blue Book at that time was war propaganda. Turkey addresses the events of 1915 as common suffering, but opposes the recognition of this issue as genocide by other countries and the usage of it as a means of pressure or blackmail. In 2005, Prime Minister of the Republic of Turkey sent a letter to the President of Armenia and proposed to form a joint historical commission. The proposal suggested that the events of 1915 should be studied not only in the archives of Turkey and Armenia, but also in the archives of all relevant third countries, and the findings should be shared with the international public. In 2009, again with the goal of normalisation of the relations with Armenia, Protocol on the Establishment of Diplomatic Relations and Protocol on the Development of Bilateral Relations was signed in Zurich. However, the decision of the Constitutional Court of Armenia on January 18, 2010 had preconditions and restrictive provisions, impairing the letter and spirit of the protocols. Armenian President Sargsyan recalled the protocols from the Parliament of Armenia in February 2015 and declared the protocols null and void on March 1, 2018. Turkey unilaterally took many confidence-building measures as an indicator of its goodwill and determination about normalising its relations with Armenia. However, Armenia has not been able to adapt the same constructive approach. Acting with hostile intentions in the interests of the great powers will benefit no one, just as it was the case in the past. Developing mutual cooperation and good relationships in line with the true interests of the lands we live on would undoubtedly be the only way forward for the two nations, who managed to live in harmony for centuries.